right, everybody. Well, welcome to the program. It's good to be with you guys again for another episode of Red Grace Live. And as always, I'm joined by Michael Whitehead. My name is Emilio Ramos. Michael, welcome to the show tonight. How are you doing, brother?
Man, it's been a busy day, busy week. The summer just doesn't slow down, so always fun. And the world's falling
Absolutely.
apart. And the world's falling apart as well. So that's a little bit nutty.
Yeah, but that's why this show exists. So if where would this show be if the world was not falling apart? We, would
I
there
can't
be a
tell you.
need for this show?
Yeah,
uh, yeah, the world is pretty interesting right now, isn't it? There's a lot of headlines in the news. Maybe we'll talk about some of those things. We're definitely going to revisit something we did earlier a few weeks ago with jihad, and so that is very, very important. So today, I don't know how you feel about the new format, or at least this format, Micah, but we're doing kind of a mashup. We're kind of combining a bunch of themes together. This is not gonna send you into your production into convulsions or anything, is it? You're gonna do okay?
no. If something happens, man, master under control. I've got everything kind of just and all my screens. We're ready to go. Something
Yeah,
happens. Yeah.
yeah. I trust in your abilities to cover whatever mistakes that I make. So
Oh yeah.
that's
Sure.
that's always a safety blanket for me. No, really looking forward to. So let's open up with the first word, and then we'll jump right into the topics that we're going to be talking about tonight. So give me the first word, and we'll start.
Sounds good.
Okay, so like we said, we're going to be covering a lot of topics tonight on the show, and we're going to be discussing a number of things from the emergence of an AI church in Germany, all the way to talking about Christian theology, especially as it relates to culture. But let me just start quickly by talking about what happened in Germany recently. And we'll look at a video actually in a little bit discussing this very thing. But I think if somebody came up to you and told you, there's a church down the street and it's got a line of people wrapped around it. And the reason everybody wants to go to church is because they want to watch an AI generated robot on a screen, basically an avatar, deliver the service and the sermon completely generated by AI. I think you would probably ask me, well, what year is this? Is this 2050? Is this 2045? No, it's 2023, and people are actually doing that very thing. And so, we cover a lot of that stuff here because one of the central focuses of mine in terms of the new apologetics that I've been talking about now for a few years is to discuss the fact that we're living in a different time now. We're living in a time where AI, transhumanism, posthumanism, and that kind of thinking is getting ready to really change everything. And it's going to really challenge us fundamentally. It's going to challenge the Christian worldview. And so for us, we're going to have to really be equipped and ready to respond to issues like ecclesiology. How do you do church in this kind of situation? What is church? What becomes absolutely non-negotiable in church when you think about increasing amounts of technology being incorporated even into your worship service? What are the limits of that as we approach a world where people are going to be almost in a symbiotic relationship with technology? They won't even be able to think without some sort of AI algorithm enabling them to think a lot quicker, to think in a more augmented way. And how is that? What kind of threats is that going to pose to the church? I think those are all questions that we're going to be grappling with now for years to come. And even anthropology, what what is there, if anything, special about having in-person, person-to-person contact with real people, and now with a real pastor? How is that going to affect the way that we think about church in the not too distant future? As you know, it starts with a couple churches doing something that may to us seem to be outlandish or inconceivable, at least for a time, to all of a sudden more and more and more people are doing this. Just like, we talked last week where we covered Ray Comfort and the video that the short documentary he did there, where they're literally having implantable parties where people are getting together to get implanted with computer chips for technological reasons. I mean, it's just really interesting. Furthermore, as you think about the person to person dynamic, you start getting into areas where technology and theology come together, and you're wondering, this is not Bible software anymore. Now we're talking about competing intelligence and the merits of having either a AI generated service and sermon, or having a human person do it, so that the new conversation, at least part of the new conversation, I guarantee you, is going to be about how AI is superior to human interaction, even dealing with sermons, because unlike a human being, no doubt it will be purported that an AI pastor, I can't believe I just said that, but an AI pastor is going to produce a sermon with no flaws, with no error. So you can have a much more infallible, if you will, a error-free sermon, and a sermon that will not be erroneous in any way if you put it in the hands of AI. I mean, boy, you want to talk about complicating. You want to talk about complicating the things that we have to interact with here in the near future. And so I want to talk about that in conjunction with the idea that because of the rise in Christian illiteracy, I would go so far as to say we're not even dealing with theological or biblical illiteracy. Right now, the way that Christianity is functioning and working, the dynamics that are at work right now, we can go so far as to say we're not living in sort of theologically illiterate times or biblically anemic times. We really are living in anti-doctrinal times. People are really anti-doctrine, not so much that they have a limited understanding of doctrine. They don't want it. They don't want it in their churches. They don't want it in the pulpits. They want a very, very easy to digest, don't burden me with thinking kind of sermon, something very very easy to listen to, something very easy to comprehend. There's no intellectual, rigorous kind of challenge to any of that, and it just makes for, I think, the perfect storm again for a church generation, a generation of Christians who were really going to be challenged to discern these kind of things that are on the horizon. And so to me, I think this is so absolutely important. I think this is something that we are going to have to tackle and deal with. And of course, as we approach culture, Christianity and culture, now one of the things that we're going to have to interact with is uh, the approach, biblically, theologically, to how we interpret the culture and how the church engages the culture. Of course, that is going on right now in mass. It seems like everyone has a hot take on how do you approach the culture. And on the one side of the extreme, you may have Christians that say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so move on with your life. Don't do anything. Don't engage the culture at all. Just kind of, the church is over here, culture's over there. Never the two shall meet. And then, of course, you have the theonomic wing of the church, the postmillennial Christian Reconstructionist wing of the church, who is saying, no, we have to not only infiltrate the culture with the gospel, but inevitably, we know that through the gospel, God is going to give the church dominion over the culture and over the world. And so the issue of theonomy becomes very important. Now, you understand that G3 is coming up very quickly here in September. They're doing a pre-conference where they're going to talk about theonomy, postmillennialism, Christian nationalism, and other topics. And so all of these topics are going to be discussed by a lot of people. And I think that probably that pre-conference and that discussion that takes place there will probably generate quite a bit of conversation online, and I'm sure it's going to get a lot of people talking. So I think the fact that G3 is coming up means that we need to, in a sense, practically, we need to get ready for that discussion. And in light of that, last thing I want to say here, long first word. Last thing I want to say is that next week, Lord willing, we're going to be having a discussion with Lane Tipton on a theological journal that he wrote. Oh boy, years ago, probably 20 years ago, he wrote this. And it was posted in the Karuk's Theological Journal in 2015. And the issue deals with the exegesis of Hebrews chapter 2, particularly how it comes to bear on something like postmillennial theonomy and the theonomic thesis of Greg Bahnsen. And I think that discussion actually may turn out to be a lot more timely than we even know. And so I think it's important to have that discussion because we need to ask the questions of, if not theonomy, if not Reconstructionism, let's say, on the other hand, for people out there that understand this, let's say it's not even two kingdom theology by Van Hooser and others that are advancing this idea of two kingdoms that are, again, to be kept totally separate from one another. But where, if anywhere, do we find a proper balance for these concepts of Christ and culture? So I think that that conversation with Lane is going to prove to be remarkably useful, especially as we see all of this challenging the church in the way that it thinks about practical things like evangelism and apologetics and how we engage the culture today beyond the evangelistic level in terms of politics and economics and things like that. And so those things become very complex. And so I think a discussion like what we're going to have with Dr. Tipton is going to be super helpful. So look forward to that. So in this time that we have together, we're going to talk about all of some of those things, but we're going to talk about also the issue of jihad that we talked about a few weeks ago. So that's my opening word. And now let's get into some of these subjects. All right, Micah, we talked a little bit about jihad a few weeks ago, and it just seems like, I don't know. Look, I don't know that I have I don't know that I have a true barometer of what's being said out there in evangelicalism and in the Reformed world. But when we did that episode, I don't recall that there were a whole lot of people talking about jihad at the time, or even Muslim apologetics. And even the people that do Muslim apologetics, James White, maybe a few other websites and things, there really wasn't anybody talking about it. Now, we discussed jihad, and it's not me trying to be a prophet or the son of a prophet, but man, then all of a sudden, France literally explodes. You've been watching what's going on with France?
Well, and that's the thing. Like yesterday or the day before, I had to get on YouTube and find stories about it because I have been, it's not a full detox of media and such, but I've been kind of just not paying attention, which I kind of feel like is like the average American, average Christian's mindset these days, is just to push it out of your mind. And so I had to educate myself on the fact that some young kid was killed by the police, and then this has just sparked all sorts of uprisings that you and I discussed a couple weeks ago, in that, like, this with the immigration problem that they've been not even been having, but the amount of immigration that they are allowing into their countries unchecked is, and even us in our country as well, is now coming home to roost. And now we're having these uprisings where a spark is lighting just a blaze to the country, and you've got these leaders, national leaders, and then even into the police forces that are just hands up. We don't know what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at some of the footage coming out of France; it's absolutely horrifying. Mm-hmm. I watched a bus that somebody basically lit on fire, set it on a path, on a course. I think nobody was driving. I think they must have rigged the gas pedal, and this thing's going about 100 miles an hour down the street and just colliding into buildings and everything else. I mean, just total insanity. And there's people in the middle of the street firing off, machine guns and yelling Allah Akbar and talking about jihad. And I saw Muslims gathering in a big group, and they're talking about how that in the past it was the French and others that colonialized the Muslims, and now we will colonialize the West for Islam. you know, um, People have warned about this. Now, there's a lot of videos on the internet that talk about Muslim immigration into Europe and to the West, and the statistics on that is just staggering, absolutely
Right.
staggering. And what makes it even more staggering is what we've pointed out time and again, and that's the fact that the birth rate in all of Europe is below the necessary limit of like 2.5 kids for your way of life and your nationality, your national identity to be preserved, and at the bare minimum level that it can go on. And all of Europe collectively is below that bare minimum level when, as you mentioned, Muslim immigration is exploding, and Muslims are having 3 or 4 times as many children as Europeans. Right. And it's a recipe for a complete and total total demographic overhaul. Right. And a complete displacement movement where Europeans are being slowly but surely displaced and replaced.
Right.
And if that's not alarming to people, then you don't understand that not all worldviews are created equal. And, I used to go to the University of North Texas where I would do open air preaching, and I would bring my Quran and I'd bring my Bible, and I'd raise them up. I'd hold them up so the students can see them. And I would tell them, look, guys, not all worldviews are created equal. As much as you want to talk about liberalism, and as much as you want to talk about postmodernism and live and let live, and nothing ultimately matters, and no ultimate truth, and who cares? Everything's the same. There's no distinctions, blah, blah, blah. I promise you that if the Islamic worldview wins out in your society, in your country, in your nation, you're going to be living in a completely different world.
Right. Well,
and I would, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm not really scared necessarily of a Muslim worldview winning out. It's specifically in America, I'm scared of the leftist mindset winning out, which is driven by moral relativity. There is no right and wrong. We're all post-truth kind of mindsets, because what will happen is the left will win. Everybody will get their own truth, just whatever you want to do, whatever you want to be, and then it will be quickly eaten up by that Muslim worldview that will slit every single throat that comes across that's in its way.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, there are some Muslims out there that are responding to France. I saw videos of imams that are responding to France and said, hey, look, this is all Europe's fault, because places like France, they brought in millions and millions of immigrants from the Muslim world, and they didn't bring in people that wanted to integrate into European society. One imam went so far as to say they brought the worst of the worst into their culture. Yeah. And so he blamed them and wanted no part of this. And so there are some Muslims that have been kind of nominalized so that they have a nominal worldview, even as a Muslim, and they're not calling for some sort of radical, overt jihadist approach, and they don't want to create dhimmis, and they don't want people to pay the jizya tax necessarily, and those kinds of things. But it doesn't matter, because anywhere where Islam has predominated, you're always going to have people that want to influence it in a more hardline direction. And so however Western people are, let's say in Dubai, however Western people are, however nominal they are in places like Tanzania or Qatar, or even in some places in Saudi Arabia, okay, where for them, progress in areas like basic human rights and basic women's rights is that just recently women were given the right to drive. I mean, that's progress for them. So So I'm telling you, it's a serious problem, and it comes back, Micah, to what I was talking about. With it's kind of ironic, but I was talking about Zaid Qutb in the book Milestones. Remember that little
Mm-hmm.
book? And I talked about immigration, infiltration, domination. And so, can you imagine in France if and when the population reaches somewhere around 40 to 50% of the country, which they're saying we're going to be there mid-century.
Wow.
So, I mean, man, can you imagine it? Then there are already in Europe, I'm sure you've heard of this. I'm sure people have heard of this. There are already in numerous places in Europe no-go zones where
Yeah.
you're not really allowed to go if you're not Muslim. And I have seen the footage in these no-go zones where any European person goes into these cities and neighborhoods literally at your own risk. I have seen in London where Muslim men patrol certain neighborhoods and certain streets, and they're literally like modesty police. If they find women that are walking around immodestly, they literally surround them and begin to accost them verbally and berate them and tell them that they can't dress like that in this neighborhood. I mean, and if we think, Micah, well, that's over there, that's across the pond, that doesn't affect us, we're in America, we're safe. Well, just take a drive down to Dearborn, Michigan, and do some open air preaching down in Dearborn, Michigan, in certain neighborhoods of Dearborn. I've seen videos in Dearborn, Michigan, where you would think you're watching something in Kazakhstan or something, where you cannot, as a Christian preacher, stand in public unmolested by Muslims, standing up, holding up the Bible, and preaching. Now, that's to say nothing of the people that were preaching there. I don't know anything about their ministries. I don't know anything about their reputation or their theology.
Right.
But all I know is that I've seen multiple videos where Christians are literally attacked, physically beaten, and having things thrown at them by hundreds of Muslims, let's say at a festival or something like that, where street preachers went out to try to share Christ with people. Nope, not going to happen.
Yeah. And
those demographics, again, in America are just growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, the demographics in places, and especially in the highly populated metropolitan areas, the Islamic presence is just growing exponentially. And so this is something that we're going to have to contend with, like it or not. So,
well, and especially with the current American stance on immigration, where it's just a free for all at our border, it really is a time for the church, especially in the political sense, to stand up, not be buying for influence, but stand up for biblical values that can help turn America back to a more, at least just God-fearing society.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with that. I think that's part of our witness. That's part of our evangelistic task and all of that. But honestly, it brings up another big issue, and that is this. We talk so much about culture wars and what we're seeing in the nation and in the world. It's like right now, pick your cultural war, right? I mean, everything from gender, sexuality, comparative religion, everything, climate. I mean, listen, I don't know if you know this, Micah, the largest social movement on the planet, okay, is not what's going on with wokeism or LGBTQ, none of that. The largest social movement on the planet that has more organizations basically than anything else is environmentalism.
Doesn't shock me at all.
Yeah. And so through environmentalism, all sorts of different worldview things are being introduced. But whether it's the environment, whether it's sexuality, whether it's racism, whether it's, any of those things, any political hot button issue that you can think about, I want to just challenge us a little bit today, and even myself by way of reminder, that really when it boils down to these cultural wars, when seen from the perspective of the biblical worldview, and let's say the apostolic understanding of the way that this world works, what is really going on in this world, what is moving all of these parts around. I know that we know this, and I think what I'm about to share with us is elementary, but Ephesians chapter 2, if you can put that up there, I wanted to interact a little bit with this text because in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, this is a passage that we go to all the time. This is a passage that we go to most of the time to talk about total depravity when you want to talk about the doctrine of sin, because we were dead in our trespasses and our sins in which you formerly walked. And so we use that a lot to discuss, hey, we were dead in sin. See, this is why the doctrine of total depravity is true, because in your sin, you couldn't do anything for your salvation, and that's absolutely right. But this text is actually more eschatology than it is soteriology. And I don't know if people understand that, because Paul goes on to say, and let me explain what I mean by eschatology. Paul goes on to say, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Why do I say eschatology? It's not because this is a passage on the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's not. But this passage is a two-age passage. This is a passage that is telling us about the way this present world functions, the way that this present world is working. And if you would, Ephesians chapter 2 is a parallel to Galatians chapter 1, verse 4, where we are told about the present evil age and the fact that Christ delivers us from the present evil age. Maybe another parallel passage would be in Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, where we are said to have been rescued out of the domain of darkness. And so all of those texts working together, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, many other places, we are being told of what is commensurate in this world, in this age. And here in Ephesians chapter 2, we're given various factors of what this age looks like. Number one, he says it is the course of this world. And this idea, this language here of the course of the world is interesting because he uses the Greek word aionios, which basically just means age. So literally, Paul says that walk according to the age of this world. And so that's really interesting, because what Paul is basically saying is that this is part of this world age, and that is an entirely spiritual category and an entirely eschatological category. You see, this world, this whole world, is consigned to a particular way of life, a course, a spirit, he'll go on to say. We can say this, it is an influence. And man, doesn't that help us to understand? I mean, I don't know, Micah, if you think when you look at all the individual things that are going on, to know comprehensively that all of those things can be kind of wrapped together and put underneath the overall category, that there is a specific influence that kind of governs them all. And sure, whether that's in the past, in the present, or in the future, Paul's point is this: it will never end. It will never change, not in this age.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think you're kind of hitting onto something that a lot of really the American population really doesn't fully understand, because of one of the things that you said in your first word, which was the fact that we're kind of doctrinally illiterate. We're just looking to Revelation or any sort of eschatology to say, oh yeah, that's how we're going to count how many more days it is till Jesus returns. Well, it's not about that. It's talking about, or it's not just about that. Let me put it that way. It's about us living a life for Christ and having the best influence that we can on our culture, despite the fact that our culture is not, it is run by the prince of this world, which is Satan.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. And as much as we try to wrap our brain around what's going on in the current, as we look at the headlines, I do it. I know you do. I mean, we all do it, right? We look at what's going on right now. All of a sudden, here we are. We're talking about liberal ideas. We're talking about feminism for decades and decades and decades. And all of a sudden, it becomes the same-sex marriage controversy. And we are in that for another few decades arguing about that. And then out of nowhere, here comes the wokeism all over again, which is just a rehashing of old liberal ideas. And now the church's eye is focused on CRT and wokeism and everything like that. And then we switch over to this whole gender thing and this whole trans fluid. Well, I don't know what's next.
Well, it's like we're chasing this little rabbit around, and we're not noticing what's actually happening in the other hand. And so something's changing, but we're all focused on, and rightfully so, wokeism. We're being forced with the trans activists stuff down our throats, and for those of us who have young kids, having to not watch. I tell you, one of the reasons why I don't watch nightly news anymore is because of every single night I cannot watch the news without having to mute it or have to try to explain to my 9-year-old what exactly that they're talking about.
Exactly right.
It's just wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, it's become so debauched and so incredibly just beyond words. I mean, we're just gone. Right. And if we don't understand what you said in terms of the evil one, Satan, the God of this age, that's another text, right? We know that passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, that the whole world, right, is dominated in a sense by the God of this age. John says the whole world is in the lap of the evil one, 1 John chapter 5. And we understand this, and as long as we understand that this is truly a spiritual eschatological issue, in Ephesians chapter 2, when the Apostle Paul says that is working in the sons of disobedience, you got to remember, man, this is why, sort of any theology that is offering you some sort of temporal hope of a Christianized world is simply out of step with the theology of Paul. I mean,
This is not our home.
This is not our home. And Paul is saying that coextensive with this world age, as he calls it, are the sons of disobedience. So here it is. As long as you have the sons of disobedience, you will be in this present world age, the present evil age. You will be in this dispensation, if you would, this time of what is called the present age, this age, and not in the age to come. And so for the Apostle Paul, he doesn't separate the two. You can't have sons of disobedience without the present evil age. You cannot have the present evil age without the sons of disobedience. They go together.
Right.
And that's why it will never have some kind of semi-heavenized world. And we will never have a temporal sort of Christian victory in this world where we sort of take it over, begin running it in a Christian way, and start, taking over all of the institutions and centers of political power and economic power. That's because all of those things, when you look at scripture, um, everywhere, the socio political economic network of this world is all bound together with the spirit of this age. And so you cannot expect that the Christian church is ever going to take over the World Bank. The IMF is never going to take over Wall Street and is never going to take over the oil industry, okay, and control the economy. And I'm sorry, I mean, I hate to pick on, post-millennial type theology, but I tell you what, you really are offering people a false hope. And then here's the question I would have here, because I don't want to spend too much time on this, because I know, Lord willing, next week with Lane Tipton, if we can lock that down, I know that we're going to get into some of these issues. But I will say this: I don't know, Micah, if you could bring up Revelation chapter 17. If you can bring up Revelation chapter 17, oh boy, we'll have to look at a couple verses here, brother. But if you look at Revelation 17, verse 13, and then if you jump down and if you look at verse 17, so Revelation 17:13 and Revelation 17:17, there is a word that is used here repeatedly. It is the word purpose. And when you see this word, you're kind of wondering, where does this come from exactly? What is John talking about? What is he seeing? What is he talking about? And when you understand biblical theology and the idea that what you're getting in the book of Revelation is the culmination of just enormous amounts of imagery and symbolism and typology that comes from all the way from Genesis, really, but from the Old Testament leading into this apocalyptic vision. John is pulling from Daniel and Ezekiel and Isaiah. He's pulling from Zechariah. He's pulling from Genesis. But what he's talking about right here is he says these, that is the 10 powerful kings that he sees that have a kingdom and give the kingdom over to the beast. It says these have one purpose. And that's what I want to focus in on, is this Greek word here, purpose, nomen. And this Greek word here, I believe, along with exegetical commentaries like G.K. Beale, many others have pointed this out, that this purpose actually comes from the Genesis text of Babel, in Genesis 11. And then if you look at verse 17, these have one purpose together, and they give their power and authority to the beast, which is presumably Antichrist. Now, if you look at verse 17, something interesting happens to this purpose, because there's a play on words. It says God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose, which is really interesting. So first of all, they have a purpose. And then all of a sudden, it says that God has a purpose. And therefore, God has essentially one purpose. They have another purpose. What is this? What is going on here? If you're reading your Bible, you should be asking yourself, what's happening here, right? And that is this, that God has decreed in his kingdom purpose, he has decreed that all the kingdoms of this world will be united in one purpose. You ever wonder what motivates all these people? What's the agenda that moves this whole system along? As you're watching Fox News, as you're watching the headlines, as you're reading your Twitter feed, and you're seeing all the same stuff coming out from 1,000 different outlets, and they're all talking about the same stuff. And you're wondering, how can we get to the point where we're having things like Bud Light and what they did? How can you get to the point where you're having things like, Target and what they did? How can you get to the point where they're having, drag queen story hour at the local, library? How in the world do we get to this point? And if you try to pinpoint it to one person or one movement or one book, or you try to go back to the sexual revolution in the 60s or whatever, I would tell you that that we're falling short, because we don't understand that this purpose, if you would, this antichrist purpose that generates the direction of the cultures of this world are all ordained, decreed, and directed by God. That God is actually working in these powerful leading entities in the world. They think they have united for a purpose, but in the end, it's only God's purpose that will win out. It is a Harmageddon moment. It is God bringing the world to a point of final cataclysmic judgment. Now, I know, Micah, that's not going to be a very popular message. You want to talk about Calvinism?
I enjoyed it, but yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, like, this is the sovereignty of God.
Yeah.
I mean, this is
Absolutely.
full metal Calvinism. I mean, if you don't believe in the eternal decree of God that has ordained not just the rise and falls of empires and nation states and whatever, all throughout church history, but he has ordained all of this to culminate in one final Babylite type judgment, where for the final time, the nations will be scattered in judgment before they are, in a sense, gathered for eschatological glory, not for the kingdom purpose of this world, but for the kingdom purpose of the kingdom of God in heaven.
Right.
And really, I mean, you know, a lot of folks like, I think, what popular theonomists and reconstructionists are saying, because they think, oh, this will help me engage the culture. Oh, this gets me really going. This is a theology of power. This is a theology I can get behind because now I feel like I have a voice again, or I can speak to the issues. Well, absolutely, we can speak to the issues all we want, and we should. We ought to. We need to infiltrate this culture with the gospel at every level that God opens a door for us to do. That was Paul's prayer, remember? The Apostle Paul prayed that an effectual door would be opened to him so that he can preach the gospel. He did that in Rome. He did that among the soldiers that arrested him. He did that in the house of Caesar. The Apostle Paul took advantage of whatever evangelistic and missiological opportunity that God gave him. But one thing that the Apostle Paul did not do is he never proffered, he never set in front of the Christian church this sort of idealistic world where the kingdoms of this world would be slowly transformed, Christianized, and eventually brought beneath some sort of temporal dominion under Christendom. That is completely foreign to the apostolic tradition, to the theology of the Apostle Paul. And here now in Revelation, we see that all the way, well, obviously this presumes that you have a somewhat either a premill or amill interpretation, futuristic interpretation of the book of Revelation. You don't have a preterist interpretation, let's say. But here we are leading up all the way to the parousia proper, the second coming of Jesus proper, because I've got news for you. The end of this chapter, chapter 17, verses 13 all the way down to the end, really is something of a parallel of chapter 19. And in chapter 19, verses 17 all the way to verse 19, well, really to the end of the chapter, in chapter 19, you have the return of Christ. And then again, the parallel in chapter 20, verse 8 through 10. So sorry, guys, for a lot of scripture there, but chapter 17 at the end, chapter 19 at the end, chapter 20, verses 7 all the way down to verse 10. These are all parallel concepts, parallel ideas. Chapter 16, verse 16, Harmageddon, or sometimes translated Armageddon. Doesn't matter. Both of them mean the Mount of Megiddo or the Mount of Mageddon, where it's no longer about a location, it's about an event. Harmageddon is not a location because there really is no such thing as a mountain of Megiddo. There really is no geographic location where there was a literal mountain of Megiddo. It is literally talking about, and it's apocalyptic imagery at this point, prophetic idiom, to speak about a totalizing eschatological event at the end of time where God brings the nations together under their own delusion in order to encounter them in final judgment. And Micah, seriously, I think for our viewers and people, the concept of final judgment, we're losing our grip on that. I don't know about you. There are so many folks calling for things to happen now.
Sure.
There is so much engage the culture now, do it now, see results now, build a Christian business now, be a Christian entrepreneur now. Okay, I got all that. Great.
Right. Yeah.
But we cannot lose the vision of the final eschatological judgment brought about by the parousia of Jesus Christ, the second coming. We're just it's losing its effect on us. And I'm here to say, in true pilgrim theology, we cannot lose sight of that. That is our hope. This is what our souls are to. This is the hope that we cling to. We cling to the fact that Jesus Christ will usher in the final vindication for his people. And it's not going to be by raising the Christian flag over the White House. That's not final vindication.
No.
So I just think, a little bit of eschatological realism is what we need at this point. And so I've talked a little bit about it, but I think our next episode, hopefully with Lane, will go in depth. Micah, my hope is that with Lane Tipton, we'll go deep enough where we'll probably need a couple episodes on this.
Yeah, I kind of have a feeling every single time I've been in a room with the two of you guys just kind of yammer and talk. My eyes kind of go to screensaver mode, and I just kind of pop in whenever I can.
Be true. No. Be honest. You go into sleep mode.
Oh, no doubts. But one of the things I do want to point out is about 5-10 minutes ago, you said the word dispensation in a very positive note, but I'm just gonna point it out. Don't need to say anything else about it. But
you're gonna point it out and leave it there.
I'm just gonna leave it right there. But one of the things that I find every single time that this topic gets brought up about the post-mill eschatology is, I think that creating a Christian business is a great thing. I think that creating
we both have Christian business. What are you talking about?
100%.
You have a Christian business, and so do I.
Correct. But how that plays into the return of Christ, and God's not going to send Jesus for his bride until I have successfully converted my neighbor through my Christian business or whatever kind of Christian works that are in place is kind of completely anti-gospel, anti-biblical kind of a mindset. And of course, you're more studied in the deep theology of it, but I'm just looking at it on a practical level and saying that, if salvation is a gift and it's 100% grace and it's no works at all, then why would my work be dependent upon when Christ returns?
Yeah, it really is. Look, everything that we do in this world will redound to eternity. We don't need Christian Reconstructionalism or postmillennialism for that. We are told very clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 that ministry, for example, whatever you do in ministry, right, it will be tested in eternity by fire. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 10 and 11, we are told that we will, all of us, stand before the judgment seat of Christ.
Right.
And give an account for everything that we've done, which the Apostle Paul says, knowing the terror of the Lord. We need to do an episode, Micah, write this down. Don't let me forget it.
Okay.
we need to do an episode on Christians not being afraid of God, and talk about bringing in a healthy balance. Because for the Apostle Paul, he had to stand before the judgment seat of Christ in the final great assize, final judgment, not for damnation, but for the purification of his works and his motives and his deeds. He called that the terror of the Lord.
Yeah.
And so it is a friendship and a fear, brother. We are in a friendship and a fear. We love the Lord our God. We cry out to him, Abba, Father, but he is our creator, Lord, and judge.
Right.
And we can never stop fearing him who is a consuming fire. And sadly, today, what you have in most churches are a bunch of wimpy pastors with sissy sermons where they don't want to talk about fearing God anymore.
Right.
They don't want to talk about a God so majestic, holy, sovereign, a consuming fire, one with whom we have to do. That has vanished. That disappeared with Jonathan Edwards or something. And it exists only sporadically here and there in certain reformed situations.
Well, tell me,
You know?
tell me this. I mean,
Yep.
I kind of put a lot of the blame of this on the Buddy Jesus movement, where he's my best friend, kind of a response. And I truly believe that Jesus is, he does love us. Here's the question I have for you in that regard. And as far as the Trinitarian breakdown of Christ and God the Father and the Holy Spirit, do you draw a line anywhere in there in that Christ is the true Savior and God's wrath is something that we should be afraid of versus the Christian? And maybe that's a question for that episode, but maybe you can give me the 30-second here.
No, like I said, I mean, we are not afraid of final wrath.
Oh, 100%.
Right? The Apostle Paul says in Thessalonians, God has not destined us for wrath. Mm-hmm. And he's not talking about the tribulation. He's talking about final wrath.
Yeah.
We are, however, appointed to a day of judgment. Right. And that day of judgment is for God to judge, to purify, and to distill the nature of our works as in a refiner's fire. Mm-hmm. And whatever we did that was not rooted in authentic Christian motivation and the fruit of the Spirit, and whatever we did that was not in keeping with biblical theology, with biblical Orthodox Christian doctrine, with the faith, will burn on that day. It will vanish before our very eyes. And sadly, for a lot of Christians, man, that can mean a big, great deal of your life. If you're in a fraudulent theological situation where you're just, you're not doing things to the glory of God, you're doing things for the glory of man or whatever, on the day of judgment, all that work will vanish. Now, I think there's something to be said for people that have pure motives, but they're in a bad church or they're in a bad ministry or they're involved with bad people, and yet they're serving the Lord with a sincere heart, and they're not meaning to be in a bad doctrinal situation. I think that God will test the hearts. He is the discerner and the tester of the hearts, as Scripture says. And so in that sense, that is what we ought to fear, and ultimately understand that is a call for self-introspection, self-examination. And so I think that's really important. But we do that with the confidence, like you said, that Jesus is an all-sufficient Savior, and that we are saved not because we passed some kind of litmus test in the end. Absolutely not. I forgot who said it, but when we die and go to face God on the day of judgment as Christians, that day is not the day to decide whether or not you go to heaven or hell. That was already decided at the cross and applied at the moment of your conversion.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Praise God for that, right? But yeah, man, I just think that ultimately, we need to grasp what Dr. Tipton, I think, is talking about in his Karuk's journal, as we think about the issues of culture, church culture. How do we engage? How do we not engage? Those kinds of things. And if I can just talk about that for a minute here,
sure.
what Lane is going to talk about is he's going to be talking about Hebrews chapter 2. And he's going to really be talking to us about something he found that was detrimental to the theonomic thesis that was put together by Greg Bahnsen. And that is Bahnsen's failure to grasp semi-realized eschatology. He just doesn't, in his book, in his work on theonomy, he just doesn't grasp how that the application of the wrath of God upon the Son of God on the cross is a semi-realized pouring out of the wrath of God that essentially comes into time before the final judgment. And that how that all of those old covenant sanctions, penal, all the civil laws and all the sanctions that came with that was applied to Jesus there on the cross so that he bore the wrath for all disobedience for his people. And therefore, what Lane does is he shows how that what the author of Hebrews is warning us about now is no longer a return back to being careful not to fall under the judgment of the theocratic sanctions of Israel, because those things have been fulfilled and completely replaced by Jesus Christ. But that what the book of Hebrews is warning us of right now is not some new application of a Christian theocracy, but is warning us of final judgment proper if we neglect so great a salvation. And what Lane does in his journal is he shows you that this is actually the theology that you find throughout the book of Hebrews. And so I don't want to steal any of Lane's thunder. I want him to come in because he's also going to talk to us a little bit about what's a proper understanding of the theocracy, and also what are some of the errors that can arise hermeneutically and things like that from a postmillennial theonomic hermeneutic. And so very, very important stuff. Wow. Micah, there's another thing I wanted to get to, and that is the idea of AI. And how, I know that was one of the points that I wanted to hit, but because I wanted to encourage us, at least maybe even encourage myself, this idea that there is a increasing awareness right now on AI. And the reason I mention this is because of the stuff we just did with Ray Comfort, but also as I'm talking to different leaders and pastors and things, more and more people are waking up to this. And so to illustrate the threat, I wanted to play this video. I know that we queued up to give people a realistic sense of how imminent this really is. I started out the first word talking about how you would be shocked. You probably wouldn't believe it if somebody told you, hey, did you hear there's a church with a line wrapped around the back? Or maybe in this crazy world, you would believe it and you would, and it wouldn't surprise you as much because we live in a crazy world.
Right.
But if someone were to tell you, hey, man, there's a church with a line wrapped around the back of people waiting to get in to go to an AI-generated service with an AI avatar serving as pastor, if can we even say those words, right? But anyway, the proof's in the pudding. So, Micah, let's play this. I might stop it just to comment on a couple things, but let's play this video nonetheless.
Here you go.
In the house of God, everyone is welcome with open arms, even robots. Like it or loathe it, ChatGPT is part of society and now part of the congregation. As Germany's churches experience a drop in numbers of pastors, this church in the Bavarian town of Fürth has the answer by using artificial intelligence. During service, this avatar preached to more than 300 people for Mass. But can we really commune with robots?
I was pleasantly surprised at how well it worked. But one thing I definitely missed, of course, was simply emotionality.
It was exciting, interesting, but for me, it was too monotonous. The avatar spoke too quickly. Sometimes you couldn't really think in your head during the service. It wasn't personal enough.
So, in this church, worshippers are no longer inspired by the words of a preacher. And while some may say this is sacrilegious, the theologian behind it insists this is the future of worship.
I would say 98% comes from the machine, generally speaking. And what we're going to see is an effort of us as human beings staying out of the church service.
Well, let me stop right there and just talk about that right there, Micah, because, okay, we've seen some key things here, but one of the things that people need to understand, Micah, is that this is not a unique video. There's several videos like this, actually. Mm-hmm. And I covered this on an episode that I did for the New Apologetics. If you want to go there, go look that up in the playlist on Red Grace Media. But I covered that already because there are other church services that have been done with a Catholic monk that is a robot. There is a Buddhist monk that is a robot, actually in-person robot, not an avatar on a screen. And so we have other spiritual things going on, okay, in this pagan world where now we have, forget an avatar on a screen or virtual reality, but they have literally in-person robots which are loaded up with AI algorithms to be able to interact with the congregation. This is now where we're at. This is what's coming. And this is part of why I introduced the concept at the very beginning, where if you think this is not going to catch on, I think one of the angles that we need to be careful about here, what could be an approach in the near future, is the idea of super intelligence, at least general AGI, artificial general intelligence, right? Where we're going to be talking about, okay, we've passed the Turing test. You know what the Turing test is, Micah?
No.
Is the Turing test is a test that was put together by a mathematician by the name of Alan Turing in 1950, where he said that we have achieved some level of artificial intelligence if a qualified and skilled evaluator could talk to a human being on the one hand and a machine on the other hand, and get to a point in his evaluation, asking a series of questions and whatnot, where he could no longer tell the difference between a human and a machine. And ever since then, it's called the Turing test. Yeah. People have been arguing for, have we seen limited iterations of technology passing the Turing test? And we now hear, by according to people like Ray Kurzweil and others, that the Turing test has in fact been passed in instances, but will in the very near future now. Now, this is what's interesting. By 2050, there will no longer be the need for a Turing test.
No, yeah.
It will be gone. And we will have successfully passed the Turing test. Exponential growth of technology will take us there. Mm-hmm. And can you imagine, fast forward 25 years from today into a time of the singularity where we truly reach that place of exponential growth in technology. We can no longer predict what the AI will do. We have passed the Turing test by flying colors, and the people now in that pew in Germany will not be able to tell if they're interacting with a human brain or a machine brain. Interesting?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's also terrifying at the same time. Specifically, I'm a big lover of science fiction stuff. If it doesn't deal with the past or some sort of space thing, I typically won't watch it. Kind of an approach. But that's all great for entertainment and such like that. Whenever we start taking the word of God and saying, here you go, AI, give us a sermon, or here, let's talk about X, Y, and Z, and it just pops out this sermon that basically is most likely just going to be humanistic, because who's programming these things? If we could get, Lane Tipton to be programming these things, I might trust the AI, but we're not. Years ago, one of my sisters dated an engineer for Google, and my goodness, thank goodness she's not married to that guy. She only dated him for a short time and he was a pretty decent high level person at Google, but no common sense, no biblical worldview, no understanding of where some of these ideas typically lead to. And it terrifies me that we're allowing some, and some even that are maybe a part of us, are actually treating God's word like this.
Yeah. Now, isn't it ironic that the very objections that these people raised were that these things were just not human enough? You caught that?
Yeah.
Well, guess what they're working on right now? They are working on exactly those aspects of AI. They are working on making sure that you can't tell the difference between human-generated emotion and human emotion. And you won't be able to tell the difference. And the kind of advanced robotics they have now with Amica and robots like that. I don't know if you've seen Amica, but Amica is known as the most realistic robot in the world, and the facial expressions and the synthetic skin and everything that it already has, it makes facial expressions that are just ultra human. And so again, fast forward, to Amica 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0. I mean, we're going to get to that place where we're creating, forget about digital avatars, but we're creating super intelligent robots with hyper realistic, almost, just like being unable to discern between human and robotic interaction and emotion and spontaneity. That's another thing that the avatars are being trained with right now, and the AI and large language models like ChatGPT and everything else. It's the element of spontaneity, because that's what makes us human, that we're spontaneous. Right. You never know what I'm going to say. You don't know what emotion I'll have when I say it. And so this element of spontaneous thinking and unpredictable emotion and thinking, these are the kind of algorithms being fed into these machines right now. And so pretty soon you will have a whole constituents of leading engineers, scientists who are saying that we cannot tell the difference anymore between human and machine generated emotion.
Right.
So I'm just saying, Micah, that we need to prepare, and we'll watch the rest of this, but we need to start asking ourselves some very serious questions. I'll ask these questions on the other side of this clip right here.
Okay.
The 40-minute service saw the bot writing the sermon, prayers, and even accompanying music. Intrigued and filled with anticipation, churchgoers queued for an hour to get front pew seats.
Is this Hillsong Church?
Just how it works.
No?
I told the artificial intelligence, we are at the church congress. You are a preacher. And the motto is, now is the time. What would a church service look like? And then it spits out a rough framework first. And then you say, okay, now why don't you do this introduction? And then she writes this introduction. And that goes on and on. You end up with a pretty solid church service, I would say.
Whether you're a believer,
well, there you go,
not,
a pretty solid church service. And we failed to point out, Micah, the obvious, that of course this female avatar preacher,
I wasn't going to bring that up, but I did notice that straight out of the gate.
I will. Yeah, of course it's an egalitarian avatar, right? Of
exactly. It's a Lutheran church. What do you expect?
It's a Lutheran church, of course. Yeah, and and there you go. And so you can take a large language model like ChatGPT, tell it to structure a church service, tell it that it is now the lead preacher in that service, and to preach on something. It will do all the above. It'll do anything that you want. Mm-hmm. It's funny because we covered Ray Comfort's stuff on AI, mm-hmm. and yet Ray Comfort says in one of his recent podcasts he uses ChatGPT to prepare for the podcast. So he asks the AI to give him useful information for his Christian podcast, and he says the information it spits out is incredible. It leads him to think in myriad of ways, and that again, it gets into the discussion of like, what are the proper leverages,
correct,
and leveraging points of technology? Can we use AI to make Red Grace Live better? To get, can you go as a researcher Micah, and say, hey, well, Pastor Emilio is going to be talking about this today, and I need 10 quick points on this.
Yeah.
I would say, yes, you can do that. Of course you can do that. But it's kind of like the analogy of the frog in the boiling pan, right?
Yeah.
Just know that the more that you use it, the more you feed into it, the hotter that water is getting for your life and for your world.
Don't scare me.
The more post-human the world is becoming, the more humans interact with the AI.
Yeah.
That is something that you have to understand. You have to remember.
Okay.
It might seem benign, but it's not.
Well, I mean, so my typical functionality with ChatGPT is to, present it something and then get a response back and then modify it, never taking it wholesale and just doing that. What's the difference between that and me just calling you and saying, and me just asking you the same questions and modifying your response?
Speed, efficacy, comprehensibility. I don't have as much information as ChatGPT.
Right.
So you can call me and get my opinion on this subject or that subject, but with my finite mind and my finite brain and my finite amount of time, I cannot go and research the amount of data that the AI can.
Right.
And so you are getting a more vastly comprehensive researcher, if you would.
Right.
This is something that
I view it as an assistant, essentially.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I talked about this book the other day, but if people go out and grab this book by Mo Gadot, it's called let's see if I can get this in the right shot. Maybe not.
No, maybe not.
Yeah, but this book right here by Mo Gadot is called Scary Smart. You can read the title. Okay, but this book right here is good because what Mo Gadot is doing is he is giving you non-negotiables of what technology is doing, and what is coming, and some kind of non-negotiable, inevitable situations that are coming, very basic ones as far as like we will develop AI, bad things are going to happen. We have an opportunity to interact with it and change it, for our good or for our destruction. It's just crazy. But one of the things that Mo Gadot is saying is that right now, as we speak, the best researchers, communicators, and he used some other categories like gaming and stuff, are no longer humans. So the greatest communicators on the planet right now are machines, not humans. This is what we're talking about. And this is where technology is going to get scary smart.
Right.
Not just smart. It's going to get scary smart. And I think that's very useful for us to understand. Let's finish the video, and then I'm going to ask a bunch of questions to our audience.
Okay.
Whether you're a believer or not, the use of AI arguably brings services into the 21st century, allowing them to become more accessible and inclusive. But there's certainly no doubt it takes practice what you preach to a whole new level. Shadi Edward Stashly, TRT World.
Yeah, we will interact with it. That is basically the lesson there, is get ready. You're in a brave new world. You will interact with it. And as we're thinking about AI awareness growing in the church, I want you to think about this as a Christian, and then I want you to think about it in the context of your local church. I want you to think about it in the context of the friends that you have. But how many people in your local church are reading something on AI? What does your pastor know about transhumanism, AI, artificial, intelligent robots and robotics and the singularity and things like that? Because as we just seen from that short little video, it's starting to have cash value. We're going to see more and more actual expressions of this in the real world. It's no longer going to be in the fringe, regions of the internet. It's no longer going to be just a one-off thing that happened over there. It's going to become ubiquitous in our culture, and we need to get our best thinking people to think really hard on this. One of my favorite authors to read is David Wells, because he talks about the seeker-sensitive, consumer-driven type Christian church that we're all living in right now. We need a David Wells-like researcher and historian and apologist that is comprehensively understanding how we can have a biblical worldview brought to bear on this technological front that we're facing. And so I want you to think about the fact that we haven't even begun to formulate, as a church, we have not even begun to formulate an answer to super intelligence. My kids, my daughter, your kids, Micah's kids, they're going to face this future. Period. This is their future. We don't have time to talk about some other church generation. This is their future. This is the future of our children. We'll see some of it in old age. They will see it at the prime of their age. And how much of this, therefore, are we preparing to understand the biblical worldview in relationship to superintelligence, how this trickles down to the family, how this trickles down to things like evangelism? How does this affect evangelism, where you have a whole generation of people? And I know we're going a little long in this episode, but that's okay, because these things are important. We got to think about them. We need to wrap our brain around them. How is it possible that young people right now, by the droves at this moment, along with leading high-level computer engineers at Google, Apple, wherever, Tesla, adopting simulation theory in mass? If you don't believe me, just go on to Lex Friedman's podcast, with a warning, because it's not always very Christian in content. But listen to that podcast by Lex Friedman, and you'll hear computer engineer after engineer talk about the fact that they don't know if we're even here. And how many kids at college right now are embracing this and have basically given up completely on metaphysics. They don't know what's ultimately real, and they don't care. You see how this is going to really, really affect the way that we communicate with people in the 21st century? Look, we haven't seen a generation yet of young people that are completely immersed in a culture of fakeism, where everything in the culture will be fake because you don't know what generated it. You don't know if you're looking at a picture that's a deep fake, a video that's a deep fake, a book that was written by an AI, a test that was written either by a student or by ChatGPT, a phone call that you got that is not human but was actually generated by a chatbot, an artificially intelligent machine that convinced you that you were talking to a family member. We haven't seen a generation yet that is immersed and surrounded by implantable technology, but we're about to. And where are the pastors that are going to be speaking to their people of the merits of that? Of the idea of whether or not you could actually be a Christian and start putting technology in your body for financial reasons, economic reasons, social reasons, and all of the strings that come attached to that, because you know there will be a society that is going to be completely immersed more and more and more in the virtual world. The virtual world is not going away. I promise you, it is not going away. A society like we're about to see that is completely digital. The airport at Atlanta just went to a total digital ID system. Obviously, it's going to be an education curve, but they're already rolling this out where you don't even need a physical license anymore. You're just going to have a digital ID. I mean, we're seeing little bits and pieces of this in China, But I'm just convinced there is awareness going on. There's people waking up to this, no doubt. But man, we have a lot of work to do, and there are a lot of books that need to be interacted with, books that need to be researched, and people that need to start putting out comprehensive responses to this entire point of contact with the new digital age that we're living in. So, Micah, I don't know. I think hopefully some of that will challenge people to pick up a resource like Mo Gadot, Scary Smart. I don't want to read this. I have no interest in reading this. I don't want to read that. You know what I want to read, Micah? I want to read this right here. Why do I keep showing you books you can't see?
It's because they're white covers.
This is The Wonderful Works of God by Herman Bavinck. There you go. I'd rather read that. And you know why I want to read this? Micah, do you have a couple more minutes?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to read something out of Bavinck here to fully ground us in the biblical worldview. You ready?
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I call Herman Bavinck the prophetic reformer, because I'm telling you, this guy saw beyond his years, beyond his time. He spoke to the 21st century generation by giving us a transcendent worldview. And Bavinck, as he's talking about man's highest good, his highest goal, he elevates us above this transient terrestrial plane, if you would, and he lifts us above in a transcendent way so that we find our ultimate meaning and goal and purpose in God again. And he says this: man's desire goes out to the earthly, to the sensuous and the transient. But it goes out also to heavenly, spiritual, and everlasting goods. That's the heavenly worldview. That is what Bavinck is talking about. He goes on. What man is really seeking for is not a tangible reality, but a spiritual truth, a truth which is one, eternal, and imperishable. His understanding can find rest only in such an absolute divine truth. And this is, again, telling us that this is the way that God wired mankind. We don't just seek ultimate reality here in the physical things around us, but in an ultimate, eternal, and imperishable reality. He says, and his will, again, can find its rest only in such a highest, absolute, divine goodness. Absolutely remarkable. I can go on. I'll read one more thing. Bavinck says this on page 2 of The Wonderful Works of God. This is what he says. I'm going to put the page because I hate when people give me book quotes with no reference, and then I'm like, oh, great, that sounds great, but where did that come from? So here we go. He says, even as the heart in the physical sense is the point of origin and the propelling force of the circulation of the blood, so also it is spiritually and ethically the source of the higher life in man, the seat of our self-consciousness, of our relationship to God, of our subservience to his law, in short, of our whole spiritual, moral nature. That is what man is, and that is what man is designed for: eternal, imperishable, absolute, divine goodness. Without that, all we have is circuitry, silicon. All we have is gigabytes, terabytes, and data. But data cannot give you transcendent, divine goodness. So I'll leave it there. Micah, thanks a lot, brother. That was a good time. I had a good time. We went a little bit long, but that's right.
Just a little bit long. No, it was a good conversation because it's something that I think we're all struggling with, even though and you have a way of putting things into words that I think all of us are really thinking about, and I'm glad that we're doing this just to kind of help other Christians out there, reform-minded folks who just need to think about this more deeply, and kind of begin having conversations with their family and friends. So It's a good night.
Yeah. Amen. Absolutely. Man, to all of our listeners and all of our viewers, it's good to be with you guys again. Make sure to tune in. Make sure to share, subscribe to the show, and tune in next time for another episode of Red Grace Live. God bless.